Naima lived in Makuruba, a city full of life and noise, where people dreamed big and worked even harder. For years, she had carried the silent label of being the poor relative. At family gatherings, she was the one they overlooked, the one they spoke about in whispers, the one who never quite fit in. So when the invitation for the grand family reunion arrived, she held it in her hands longer than she should have, her heart torn between excitement and fear. A part of her wanted to throw it away, to avoid walking back into the same circle of humiliation. But another part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. Maybe they would see her not as the little girl who once borrowed dresses to attend weddings, not as the one who kept her head low when everyone else boasted of their achievements, but as someone who had quietly grown into her own. She dressed carefully for the occasion, not in flashy clothes but with grace and dignity, and as she looked at herself in the mirror, she breathed deeply. All she wanted was a seat at the table, a chance to finally belong. The reunion was set in one of the most luxurious resorts in Makuruba, a place where the glass walls sparkled under golden lights, and the sound of laughter floated in the air like music. Expensive cars rolled up to the entrance one after another, their polished bodies shining like mirrors. Families stepped out in glittering clothes, brightly colored gowns, bold traditional outfits with gold embroidery, men in fine suits that looked freshly tailored. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly baked pastries, a mix of elegance and celebration. Naima arrived quietly, her car much simpler compared to the others, but she carried herself with calm dignity. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the large entrance, her eyes taking in the chandeliers that dripped with crystals, and the polished floors that reflected every movement. She could hear bursts of laughter from cousins embracing each other, aunties catching up on gossip, and uncles exchanging hearty handshakes. Everywhere she looked there was joy and warmth, but it seemed reserved for everyone else. She smoothed the folds of her dress and walked slowly, trying not to let her nerves show. She wanted to be a part of this, to share in the celebration like any other family member. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that this night might change things, that maybe someone would greet her with the same open arms she saw around the room. She smiled softly as she walked further in, trying to believe she belonged in this grand place. Deep down, she prayed that tonight would not end with the same silence and shadows she had always known. Would you like me to also add small dialogue snippets here, like cousins bragging at the entrance and Naima quietly greeting someone, to make the scene even more alive? As soon as Naima stepped into the main hall, the air around her seemed to shift. She expected at least one familiar smile, maybe a cousin calling out her name, but instead she was greeted with silence wrapped in whispers. Her cousins, dressed in dazzling clothes that sparkled under the lights, gave her quick glances from head to toe. Some raised their eyebrows as if to say she didn't measure up, then turned away sharply, pretending they hadn't seen her at all. The laughter that had filled the hall seemed to grow louder everywhere else, but around her, it faded into a cold wall. A group of aunties sitting at a table near the front leaned closer to each other when she passed. Their smirks were subtle, but Naima caught them. One adjusted her necklace and whispered something that made the others chuckle. It wasn't loud, but Naima didn't need to hear the words. She knew that laugh, the one that dismissed her like she was a stranger intruding on their world. She forced herself to keep walking, her smile gentle but trembling at the corners. When she greeted an older cousin with a polite "good evening," the cousin only gave a stiff nod before turning away to greet someone else more warmly. It was as though Naima's presence was a shadow at their celebration, something to be ignored so it wouldn't disturb the brightness of their night. Her chest tightened, but she kept her chin up, reminding herself she had every right to be there. The sting of exclusion was sharp, but she would not let them see her break. Inside, her hope dimmed just a little, but she told herself quietly, "I'll sit. I'll eat. I'll smile. Even if no one sees me, I belong here. Would you like me to also weave in a short piece of overheard gossip here? Maybe cousins whispering about her job or status, to make the sting even sharper?" The dinner tables were overflowing with food, steaming trays of jollof rice, pepper soup, grilled meats, and baskets of soft bread. Glasses of wine and sparkling drinks were passed around with laughter, the clinking of cutlery mixing with cheerful voices. Waiters moved from one side of the hall to the other, serving dish after dish to the guests. Yet, as the plates made their way across the tables, they seemed to skip over Naima as though she were invisible. Her cousins filled their plates to the brim, trading jokes about vacations abroad, new cars and business deals. Their voices rose in excitement, and every burst of laughter felt like another wall built to keep her out. She sat quietly at the edge, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth so no one would see the hurt in them. Her stomach ached, but it wasn't hunger that made her feel hollow. It was the emptiness of being unseen. Once or twice she tried to join in, smiling faintly at a joke or nodding at a story. But no one noticed. Her words hung in the air for a moment, then dissolved into nothing, swallowed by the louder voices around her. A cousin brushed past her chair without an apology, almost as if she wasn't even there. Naima straightened her back, forcing her body to sit tall while her heart grew heavy. She wanted to cry, but she swallowed the tears, telling herself that breaking down would only give them more reason to mock her later. Her dignity was the only shield she had left, and she clung to it with everything inside her. In that noisy hall full of family, Naima had never felt more alone. Yet behind her quiet eyes, something stronger than tears was beginning to rise. A strength she didn't even realize they would soon witness. Do you want me to make the next part 5? The family gossip, even sharper by adding direct whispers and cruel dialogue that she overhears? That will make the humiliation cut deeper before the twist comes. Naima sat quietly, pretending to focus on the glowing chandeliers above her, but her ears couldn't escape the sharp whispers that floated around her like poisoned arrows. Just a few seats away, one cousin leaned close to another and muttered, "She probably begged her way in here. You know how she's always desperate to belong." A short laugh followed, low enough that they thought Naima wouldn't hear. But she did. Every word slid into her chest like a knife. Another cousin, swirling a glass of wine, added with a careless shrug, "She doesn't even have a real job. What does she even do all day? She should be grateful we let her sit at this table. Honestly, I don't know why she even came." The group of them chuckled, covering their mouths, their eyes darting to Naima's direction and then quickly away. Naima's hands tightened in her lap, her nails pressing into her palms, but her face remained calm. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She kept her back straight, her chin slightly raised, even though her heart was trembling inside her chest. The gossip moved like wildfire, spreading from one corner of the table to another. Every time someone whispered her name followed by a laugh, she felt smaller, like she was being erased from her own family. Yet Naima did not speak. She breathed deeply, steadying herself, reminding herself that silence could be its own kind of strength. Behind her quiet eyes, memories of every past insult, every time she was treated as less, piled up like stones. She had endured it before, but tonight, something inside her told her that this would not end the way they thought. They believed they knew her story, but they had no idea how much it had already changed. Would you like me to now take part 6, the waiter's entrance, and really build it with tension and cinematic detail so the shift in atmosphere feels like a turning point in a movie? The hall buzzed with chatter and laughter until the heavy doors at the back opened. The head waiter entered, his suit crisp, every button shining under the light. There was something commanding about the way he walked, steady, confident, as if he carried an authority greater than anyone expected from a man in his position. The other waiters moved aside slightly, their eyes following him with respect. For a moment, no one paid him much attention. Glasses clinked, forks scraped against plates, and the music continued in the background. But slowly, the energy in the room began to change. His eyes scanned the tables with purpose, not wandering, not unsure. He knew exactly who he had come for. Naima, who had been sitting quietly at the edge, hardly noticed him at first. She was too busy keeping her composure against the waves of whispers and laughter around her. But then the waiter stopped right in front of her chair. The movement caught the room's attention. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Why would the head waiter approach her? The cousins who had mocked her leaned in with curiosity, their smiles stiffening as they waited to see what would happen. With a deep bow, one that carried more respect than he had shown to anyone else that night, the waiter said, in a clear and steady voice, "Good evening, madam." The word rang in the air like a bell. No one had expected it. Naima blinked, her lips parting slightly in surprise. The waiter's tone was not casual, not polite in the way staff usually address guests. It was reverent, purposeful, and it sent a ripple through the hall. Those who had ignored her now watched closely, their laughter frozen. The room had shifted, though no one yet understood why. "Would you like me to carry the next part?" 7. The shocking address, with the waiter's exact words, his bold announcement, in full dramatic weight, almost like a movie pause moment. Every sound in the hall seemed to disappear the moment the waiter spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried enough weight to silence the room. "Madam Owner, would you like me to prepare your private dining section now?" The words fell slowly, each one landing like thunder. Naima froze. She had not expected him to speak so loudly, nor so directly. Around her, forks stopped midair, glasses hovered inches from lips, and conversations died instantly. For a heartbeat, all that could be heard was the faint music playing in the background and the sound of someone dropping a spoon in shock. Eyes darted toward her, wide with disbelief. The same cousins who had whispered insults just moments ago now stared as if they were seeing her for the very first time. A few aunties leaned forward, mouths slightly open, their earlier smirks erased in an instant. Someone gasped so loudly it echoed across the hall. "Madam what?" one uncle whispered under his breath, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Another cousin nearly choked on his drink, coughing as he turned to confirm if he had heard correctly. Naima sat still, her calm face giving nothing away, though inside her heart raced. The waiter remained bowed slightly, waiting for her answer, his respect clear for all to see. There was no mistake. He had addressed her, not anyone else, as the owner of the very resort they were sitting in. The silence grew heavier with every second. The family that had laughed at her, excluded her, and whispered cruel words now had their eyes locked on her, searching for an explanation. In that moment, Naima's presence filled the hall more than all their glittering clothes and expensive jewelry combined. "Do you want me to now build part 8? The gasps around the table with raw family reactions, stammering disbelief, cousins exchanging panicked whispers. So the tension keeps climbing before the big reveal? The silence in the hall lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Then the gasps began, soft at first, then louder, spreading like fire around the tables. People exchanged bewildered looks, eyes darting back and forth between Naima and the waiter who still stood tall beside her chair. "Madam what?" an aunt finally muttered, her voice trembling as though the words had scraped her throat on the way out. She blinked rapidly, clutching her shawl as if she needed something to hold on to. The cousins who had spent the evening mocking her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their wide smiles had vanished, replaced by stiff, uneasy faces. One of them whispered, "Did he just say, owner?" Another cousin quickly replied, No, it must be a mistake," but his shaky tone betrayed his doubt. Across the room, an uncle who had ignored her earlier sat upright, his eyes narrowing as though trying to calculate what this revelation could mean. The whispers grew louder, rolling over the tables in waves of disbelief. "Owner? Of this place? But how? Is it really her?" Naima felt the weight of every stare pressing against her. For the first time that evening, she did not feel invisible. She felt like the very center of the room. Yet she did not gloat, she did not smirk. She simply folded her hands gently on the table, her posture calm, her face unreadable. Her cousins stared at her with something between horror and regret, their arrogance dissolving in real time. Every insult they had whispered earlier now echoed back at them, crueler than before. The aunties who had laughed behind her back now avoided her gaze, their painted smiles trembling. Confusion thickened the air, but underneath it all was something even stronger: fear. Fear that everything they thought they knew about Naima was wrong, and that their place in the room had just shifted forever. Shall I now take part 9? The revelation of truth, and expanded into the waiter explaining Naima's ownership. With the waiter straightened his shoulders, his voice clear and firm enough for everyone to hear. "There is no mistake," he said calmly. "This resort belongs to Madam Naima. She is the registered owner. Every staff member here answers to her." His words rolled across the room, breaking through the whispers and leaving only stunned silence behind. Naima sat still, her face soft, almost humble, while around her the hall erupted into disbelief. One cousin dropped his fork with a loud clang, staring as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Owner? Her," he muttered, shaking his head. An aunt's hand trembled so much that wine spilled from her glass, leaving a dark stain on the white tablecloth. Another cousin leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering, "She bought this place? When? How?" The waiter continued, respectful but firm. "Months ago, Madam Naima purchased this resort. She chose not to make an announcement, but every detail you see here, the lights, the hall, the service, exists under her ownership. The realization sank in slowly, like heavy stones dropping into water. The very hall they had laughed in, the chairs they sat on, the food they ate, the staff attending to them, it all belonged to the woman they had spent the night mocking. Naima's heart beat loudly in her chest, but she remained composed. She had never planned to reveal it like this, yet now that the truth was out, she did not shrink back. Her silence had spoken louder than anything she could have said, and her family's shocked faces were proof enough. The cousins who had called her poor now exchanged panicked glances, their pride crumbling. The aunties who smirked earlier now stared at their plates, unable to meet her eyes. Their world had tilted, and Naima was no longer the shadow at the edge of the room. She was the pillar holding it all up. Do you want me to now expand part 10? The shift in power into a vivid scene showing how the family scrambles to change their behavior, suddenly treating her with. The moment the truth settled into the air, the entire mood of the hall flipped. The same cousins who had rolled their eyes at Naima just an hour ago were suddenly leaning toward her with wide, uneasy smiles. One of them quickly pushed a plate of food in her direction. Naima, you must eat something, please. You haven't touched your meal, he said, his voice too cheerful to be real. Another cousin who had earlier pretended not to hear her greeting now stood to pull out her chair, as though he had been carrying all along. The aunties who had whispered behind their hands were now reaching across the table, offering dishes with trembling hands. Taste this, Naima. You'll love it, one insisted, her laughter forced, her eyes darting nervously to the others. Even the uncles who had barely acknowledged her presence, suddenly remembered her name and began asking her polite questions, their voices shaky with guilt. Naima accepted their gestures with a calm smile but said little. She could see through the performance in their eyes, the desperation, the regret, the sudden scramble to erase years of dismissal with shallow kindness. It didn't move her. Their fake warmth only highlighted how cold they had truly been before. Her silence was heavier than their chatter. She sat gracefully, her back straight, her eyes steady, not giving them the satisfaction of seeing either pride or bitterness on her face. The more she stayed composed, the smaller they seemed to become in their own seats. The power in the room had shifted without her even lifting a hand. She no longer had to beg for a place at the table. Every single person there now leaned toward her, hoping to be noticed, hoping to win back what they had carelessly thrown away. Would you like me to build part 11? The fiery confrontation with one bold cousin daring to question her. So Naima finally speaks and delivers a powerful line? The room buzzed with nervous chatter as relatives stumbled over themselves, trying to cover their earlier cruelty with forced kindness. But beneath the smiles and small talk, tension was boiling. Finally, one cousin, bolder, or perhaps more foolish than the rest, leaned forward, his voice sharp with frustration. Why didn't you tell us, Naima? Why keep something like this a secret? You let us sit here like fools. His words cut through the air, and suddenly the hall fell silent again. All eyes turned to Naima. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to defend herself. She simply lifted her gaze, steady and calm, her voice quiet but strong enough for everyone to hear. I didn't need to, she said softly. Then, after a pause that made every heartbeat in the room feel louder, she added, because respect should not depend on wealth. The words dropped like stones in water, sending ripples across the room. A heavy silence followed. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the clinking of cutlery stopped. Her cousins shifted in their seats, some lowering their eyes, others swallowing hard as if the truth had burned on its way down. The aunties who had mocked her earlier now sat frozen, their painted smiles gone. Naima's calm presence filled every corner of the hall. She didn't raise her voice, didn't boast, didn't explain herself further. She didn't need to. Her sentence had stripped away every layer of arrogance that had covered the room. In that moment, it wasn't her wealth or ownership of the resort that made her powerful. It was her dignity. The bold cousin who had questioned her leaned back in shame, unable to meet her eyes. And one by one, the others fell into silence, realizing how small their pride looked compared to the grace of the woman they had tried so hard to belittle. Shall I now expand part 12? The CEO guests arrive, where influential figures enter and greet Naima with respect, making the family's regret even sharper? Just when the family thought they had absorbed the biggest shock of the night, the tall doors of the hall opened again. A group of well-dressed men and women stepped inside, their presence instantly commanding attention. They weren't just any guests. They were faces many of her relatives had only seen in newspapers, on television, or in the business pages of Makuruba's most important magazines. The room stirred with whispers. "That's Mr. Kunda, the shipping tycoon. Isn't that Mrs. Bello, the real estate mogul? What are they doing here?" Their confusion deepened when the distinguished guests didn't head toward the wealthiest-looking uncles or the aunties draped in gold. Instead, they walked straight across the hall toward Naima. "Madam Naima," one of them greeted warmly, bowing his head slightly as he extended his hand. Another smiled as though meeting an old friend. "We are honored to see you again," he said. The admiration in their voices was undeniable, genuine, the kind that couldn't be faked. Naima rose to greet them, her smile calm and graceful. She shook their hands, exchanged a few soft words, and even laughed lightly at one of their remarks. To the rest of the family, it was like watching a completely different world unfold right in front of them. A world they had never been invited into. A world Naima clearly belonged to. The cousins who had called her jobless now stared with their mouths open. The aunties who once whispered about her begging lowered their eyes, shame burning hot on their cheeks. Every handshake, every respectful greeting, was another blow to their pride. It became painfully clear to all of them. Naima hadn't just survived without their acceptance. She had flourished, building connections and respect in circles they could only dream of entering. And she had done it without ever asking them for help. "Do you want me to now expand part 13? The regret that burned, showing the family sinking into guilt and realizing too late the department. The hall that had once echoed with laughter now felt unbearably heavy. Every joke they had made about Naima, every cruel whisper, every smirk suddenly replayed in their minds, but now with shame attached to each memory. The same words that had made them feel powerful earlier now cut into their own pride like sharp glass. Her cousins couldn't even look at her. One stared down at his untouched plate, moving his fork aimlessly as though food could distract him from the weight of his regret. Another kept tugging at her sleeve nervously, wishing she could disappear altogether. The aunties who had mocked Naima's clothes now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, fiddling with their jewelry, their earlier confidence collapsing. The realization was undeniable. While they had been busy laughing at her, dismissing her, and treating her as less, she had risen above them all. Their arrogance had blinded them. They hadn't just overlooked Naima, they had erased her, convinced themselves she was unworthy of respect. And yet, here she was standing taller than any of them, not because of her wealth alone, but because of her grace in the face of their cruelty. Every fake laugh, every cold shoulder, every cruel whisper now burned inside their chests. Regret was a heavy thing, and that night it sat at the table with them, heavier than the food, heavier than the music, heavier than all their pride. They realized too late that the very woman they had worked so hard to push aside was the one who carried the strength and success their entire family should have celebrated. Instead of being part of her journey, they had chosen to stand against her. And now they were left with nothing but shame. "Would you like me to now move to part 14? The woman who owned more than Wall." Naima sat quietly as the storm of whispers and regret swirled around her. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to explain herself further. Instead, she simply let a gentle smile touch her lips. A smile not born out of pride but out of deep peace. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. She glanced around the hall, at the glittering chandeliers and polished floors, at the relatives who now shifted uneasily in their chairs. Yes, the resort belonged to her, the walls and the lights and every detail that made the place grand. But she knew in her heart that what mattered most wasn't what she owned, it was what she had become. For years, they had tried to strip her of dignity, reducing her to silence, mocking her as the poor relative. Tonight proved they had failed. She didn't just own the building. They could never take away the strength she had built, the success she had carved with her own hands, the story she had written for herself. That was something no one could buy or fake. Her peace radiated across the room, humbling those who had once looked down on her. In that quiet smile, they saw more power than in all their wealth combined. It wasn't the gold on their wrists or the cars parked outside that commanded respect. It was Naima's unshakable grace. She had walked in hoping to belong, but she was leaving knowing she needed no one's approval. She belonged to herself, and that was enough. "Would you like me to now expand part 15? The lesson left behind?" giving it a strong emotional closure that feels viral and unforgettable. By the time the night drew to a close, the music still played and the lights still sparkled, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The same people who had once mocked Naima now watched her with quiet respect, their laughter gone, their pride shattered. They finally saw the truth that had been in front of them all along. The woman they had ignored, the one they had called less, was the very person they now depended on for a seat in that hall. Naima didn't gloat. She didn't throw their words back at them or remind them of the pain they had caused. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any speech. Her calm smile, her dignity, her refusal to bend to their cruelty, that was the lesson she left them with. Respect was not something to be given only when wealth appeared. Respect was something every human deserved, whether rich or poor. As the family members shuffled out of the hall, regret heavy in their steps, Naima remained seated a moment longer, her heart finally light. She had walked in carrying hope, she had endured humiliation, and she had risen without a single scream or fight. Her victory was not just in owning the resort. It was in proving that true power is found in quiet strength. And that night, her silence became the story everyone would remember, one that echoed louder than their cruelty ever could.